Civil disobedience by people with disabilities is hardly a new phenomenon. To help tell the amazing history of ADAPT, formerly Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, I spoke this week with David Perry, a disability rights journalist who has covered ADAPT and disability activism around the healthcare fight, as well as Anita Cameron, a longtime adapter who's been on the front lines of the ongoing healthcare fight. David, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So just to get right down to it, a lot of folks have seen whether tweets or images or news stories, even lots on kind of mainstream cable news in the last several weeks of people literally being dragged from wheelchairs, putting their bodies on the line to say, no, this is not what I need and what I'm asking of you as my leaders in this country when it comes to healthcare. A lot of that has really opened eyes, but this is not anywhere close to the first time that we've seen this kind of civil disobedience by disabled protesters. I would love if you would help us know a little bit of the story of ADAPT. Yeah. Who is ADAPT?
Yeah, so I know you're going to have some adapters on later to talk, and that's they'll be able to tell you their own experience. But let me talk a little as a journalist and as a historian. And I want to even go back before ADAPT. So ADAPT, to some extent, you could say it started in 1983 with formally taking that name and protesting inaccessible buses in Denver. So it has a very specific origin in Colorado, and it actually starts 10 years before that when 19 disabled people moved out of nursing homes institutions into apartments, again in Colorado, a big part of the history of the independent living movement. But what I think people really don't know beyond those specifics is that there is a decades-long, almost century-long, maybe not quite, but going back to the 50s and 60s, there is a history of a disability-related civil rights movement driven by self-advocates with support from family members, politicians, professional staff, church figures, just that goes right along and intertwines and intersects with other civil rights movements in our country, whether about the fighting segregation or fighting for LGBTQ rights or any number of these other really important struggles. And the disability rights narrative, I think, has been a little bit lost, so that when people see disabled bodies being pulled out of wheelchairs, they react with horror, but they often react with horror saying, oh, these poor people, not realizing these adapters are some of the most veteran, skilled civil disobedience in the country. They are putting themselves in that position, forcing politicians to make a choice, to arrest them and get the bad publicity, to allow them to sit in and get that kind of publicity, or to change their votes. These are very deliberate, powerful, important, classically American acts of civil disobedience with a long history.
Well, and you mentioned that it originated around transportation and trying to ensure accessibility of transportation. That's a big part of the origin story here of ADAPT, actually going back to school buses.
That's right. So if you are a person in a wheelchair, I mean, we could talk about school buses for sure, too, but I want to think about just public city buses and trains, and now we're talking a lot about taxis and Uber. You may or may not be able to drive, but if you can't drive, you're reliant on public transportation to get you around, or you're literally trapped in your location. And in the 80s, and really the late 70s, and then very formally organizing in 1983, the members of this Atlantis community in Denver decided that they were going to focus on buses. They were going to focus on public buses. They were going to get wheelchair ramps on public buses. And they sparked this group, ADAPT, which is a decentralized national movement now. They're all over the country. Every chapter runs itself. There are coordinators, but there is no national leader of ADAPT. There is no kind of single voice. There is no grand financial structure with multi-million-dollar endowments or anything. Right? These are the classic American decentralized grassroots civil disobedience, talking to each other and organizing together and showing up in D.C. So in Denver, they wanted to have accessible buses, and they decided the way to do that ultimately was to perform acts of civil disobedience, to literally roll their wheelchairs in front of and behind buses and say, we're not moving until we get a guarantee that you will build ramps on your buses. This is very powerful, right? It's powerful politically, it's powerful symbolically, it's powerful in terms of media narratives. I think when you talk to the adapters, they're very well aware of their origins and their successes. not just in terms of getting people to pay attention, but literally putting ramps on buses. One of my favorite ADAPT stories is told by Michael Bailey, who is a lawyer and the father of a woman with Down syndrome. He's based in Oregon, but he was in Kansas a few years ago, and he was watching people being arrested and being brought into school buses, and the cop was saying, why are you guys making all this fuss? And Michael said, well, you see those ramps on those school buses? You're arresting us and taking us on? We put those ramps there. And there was this wonderful picture of Dawn Russell that was on Rachel Maddow. She's a woman in a wheelchair. She's got her fist raised in the air. She was being raised up, being arrested from Senator McConnell's office just the other day, and she was being raised up on a ramp into an accessible, as ADAPT said to me, an accessible paddy wagon. That is part of their legacy. That is really part of their legacy, that government services, even when used to arrest you, must be accessible to people with disabilities.
I mean, tremendous irony there, right? That the vans, the police vehicles that are taking away the protesters who have been arrested are accessible because of those very protesters.
That's right. But ADAPT has a good sense of humor about that. We've talked about that a lot, and in part because they're performing civil disobedience, which again we talk about civil disobedience a lot, but I think we don't necessarily see it in its historical context, right? You have a situation that you feel is unjust, either a law is unjust or something will be unjust, and you deliberately go in and you break the law. And you break the law anticipating the consequences of breaking the law, and then you generate publicity and you generate moral outrage and you try to generate policy changes, right? These adapters in D.C., when you talk to them, I know you're going to talk to Anita Cameron, who I believe has more arrests than any other adapter in history, so I'm excited to hear what she has to say. They are deliberately going into a situation where they force politicians to make a choice. Will you do the right thing, or will you generate the bad publicity by hauling wheelchairs off into buses and police vehicles?
You write, for these veteran protesters, federal disability policy is literally a matter of freedom versus incarceration, life versus death. And that is not, despite what some of the healthcare bill's proponents might say, it's not histrionic. It's not just trying to throw scary words out there to make people think horrible things about this legislation. It is very real for the folks who need Medicaid services, and particularly attendant care services, as you described, so that they can truly live independently.
I want to emphasize that those aren't my words. Those are the words of the people that I've been talking to. And if you listen to them chanting and if you read their writing, I think one of the great things that's happened last week is that adapters are getting on the radio and getting in the newspaper and getting on TV, and I hope that continues, because they're the people who teach me about what the stakes are. But if someone isn't there to get you out of bed, you can't get out of bed, and if you can't get out of bed, you can't live. So then you get put into an institution, or you become homeless. And for many of these people without attendant care, their choices are institutionalization, and I want to be very clear that forced institutionalization is a form of incarceration. It is not the same as other forms of incarceration. It is not, we don't want to make kind of loose analogies. But if your only choices are to live in a nursing home or to not live at all, or to live on the streets, that is not voluntary decision making. And so these adapters, that's why they're willing to be arrested, right? That is why they're willing to have their bodies abused. Bruce Darling, one of the national coordinators who comes out of New York, his blood was literally on the floor outside McConnell's office. I think the day before yesterday, Monday, a woman had her knee dislocated by a police officer in Indianapolis, an ADAPT protester. And there's going to be more. But the other choice is to be shunted aside into these nursing homes, to be isolated from the community.
So one of the things that you've been doing in the last couple of minutes that I have with you, you spend a lot of time tweeting out information and I would encourage everyone to follow you. Your handle is LollardFish, LOLLARDFISH. You're one of my favorite follows on Twitter, particularly on disability issues. But one of the things that you've been using Twitter of late to educate people about is that the images that come come out of these dramatic protests that the media really have actually started to cover over the past week to 2 weeks in a way that I and many others are greatly appreciative of. These images sort of end up becoming the memes or the symbols of the fight to protect Medicaid, to stop the Affordable Care Act from being repealed. And one of the images that has really made the rounds and become one of those sort of signature images representing this debate is a woman in a wheelchair. The shot is actually taken from behind, and you can see her hands in handcuffs behind the wheelchair. A truly powerful image, but something that you have really gone to great lengths to educate people on Twitter about is that this isn't just an image. This is a person, and it's a person who's worth knowing. I would love if you would talk a little bit about that and why you think that's important.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that even as I was delighted to see ADAPT kind of get its due, I'm a historian as well as a journalist, so I wanted to have a historical context. I wanted people to understand this event didn't just happen, that there's, since 1983 or even earlier, 1978, 1974, this specific group has been doing these actions. I want them to know about disability rights-related civil disobedience. The longest sit-in of a federal building in U.S. history was a disability rights group in the 70s in Berkeley. We may see longer sit-ins to come, who knows? So for people to know that there's a history here of activism, to give agency to disabled people, which often in our media is taken away. And the other side of that agency is to know that this is a woman, that woman her name is Stephanie Woodward. She works for the Center for Disability Rights in New York, I think up in Rochester. She really likes her pink wheelchair. Her glasses match it. We were joking about, she and I, about this beautiful black and white version, which the handcuffs were pink, but the chair was black, and how that was totally wrong, even though it was iconic and powerful, because she chose that wheelchair on purpose. She's funny. She did finally get to write a piece the other day for Vox, which I was really happy to see. These are people who are making choices and can talk about their lived experience, but also should be seen as sort of full agents, right? That there was pushback saying, "Oh yeah, I don't believe these people are really disabled," or who wheeled them there, was the kind of right wing counter to this kind of to the ADAPT images, and we need to know that counter's coming and say, "No, I'm sorry, that's Stephanie, that's Anita, that's Greg, that's Bruce, that's Laurel," that's these actual individuals who are not just objects protesting, but people who are advocating for change, who know a lot more than I do anyway, and certainly than most people, and whose voices need to be on the television. I was really struck. It's always a danger, I think, especially among progressives, that we spend too much of our time criticizing ourselves or criticizing each other. So I love Rachel Maddow, and I was thrilled that she did a big segment on the history of ADAPT. Thrilled. Great. But at the end of it, I said, I really wish she had an adapter on air across the table from her to talk to. And I wish that when CNN is debating the healthcare bill and they have, 35 people around the table on one of their preposterous huge panels, at least one of them might be a wheelchair user, and preferably, a wheelchair user of color, or a non-white guy, and so on and so forth. That bringing these individuals, it's not even kind of a problem. It is a problem that I have 17,000 Twitter followers and Stephanie has, 3,000. That should be reversed. But I'm the one generating media, so people now see me as a node, a place to find this kind of news, and I'm trying to use that to refocus direction where it really belongs.